Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Dauphinais. And today I'm joined by a colleague in the Department of Communications, Dr. John Jasso. So welcome, John.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
That's great. And you recently gave a talk on campus about kind of the rhetoric of fairyland and Chesterton and Tolkien. And I'd just love to kind of begin maybe with a provocative question, right? Which is, it seems like a lot of people think we have so many real problems in the world that are pressing. We have political crises, we have cultural crises, we have global crises and all these elements. So if this is the case, then, why should we spend time studying fantasy literature?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid question and one that's been asked for a long time in modernity, and especially at a liberal arts institution. It's important to remember that it's part of the tradition, right? So there's just, in some ways it's that simple, but I think it's an important part of the tradition, especially as the modern age has developed, because it's pushed against some of the overt materialism, right? The modern fantasy literature is sort of birthed from the Romantic period and is seen as there's something more important than simply the material realities we see around us. And so with cultural conflict, the ability to kind of delve into ways of giving voice to some of these conflicts and imagining better futures, or simply escaping some of the brutal realities for a while are important. So anything from just taking a break to pondering and speculating about what the world could be like in different ways, I think is important.
Interesting. That is really fascinating in a way that maybe if our understanding of the world is kind of overly limited by materialism, or really just seeing kind of maybe almost like the oppressive weight of problems, then in some ways, right, our imagination for solving them becomes limited.
Yes. Yeah, and so in a lot of ways, it is a development of our creative faculties that could later be applied to these quote-unquote real-world problems. And in other ways, it might give voice to real problems that we are neglecting because of our sort of focus on the material world.
Mm-hmm. One thing that kind of strikes me is that I think sometimes we contrast storytelling and reason. Mm-hmm. And we think that maybe, we can use our reason when we do science or logic, and then we just use our imagination when we tell stories or read literature. But it dawns on me that I think that there's a strong sense that there's nothing more rational than storytelling and listening to stories. And sometimes maybe even if you try to tell your dog a story, right, the dog may fall asleep on your lap or something, but the dog really doesn't get the story. Yes. And so I think there's something here that storytelling in some ways is a great use of reason. Mm-hmm. So how have you seen that in some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, and so there's an ancient answer and a more modern answer. In Plato's Gorgias, it's a dialogue on rhetoric, and is critical. It's probably his most critical dialogue on rhetoric. But he ends it with what he says is a logos, right? Is an account, even though people might think it's a mythos or a tale or a story. He's going to tell it as if it were true, and a true logos, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not a rational argument. It is a eschatological myth about him going into the underworld and being judged and what it's like for everyone. It's a kind of parable on the final judgment. Okay. And how words won't help there, and no material goods will help there, but just your naked soul is judged. And so that's he ends on that story for a rational point, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and then the modern George MacDonald, a fairy story author, also did a lot of historical fiction. Wrote a piece on the cultivation of the imagination and pointed out that, the imagination is important for sciences, is important for telling history. Otherwise, you just have observations, right? If you're limited by the facts that you see, you can't invent hypotheses, right? He gives a story of one of his colleagues who was a mathematician who said, because of my ability to imagine, came up with a new theorem for algebra. And he doesn't name him in the footnote, but I'm almost completely sure that is Lewis Carroll. He's one of his friends. He was a logician and a mathematician, and the same thing that allowed him to write Alice in Wonderland were the faculties that allowed him to imagine how algebra worked.
So really then our whole kind of encounter with the world is both through the images and sensible realities of the world, the stories we hear, and then our ability to reflect upon them, ask questions about them.
Yes.
So in some ways, it's kind of almost, maybe a little bit of, the wisdom of children in this.
Sure.
Children observe things and they ask why.
Yes.
And they love stories.
Yes.
Right. And I think it reminds me, I think it's C.S. Lewis in his dedication to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He dedicates it to his goddaughter, Lucy, right? Lucy Barfield. And he says something along the lines that, I wrote this for you when you were younger, but now that it's published, you're too old to read, fairy tales. But hopefully when you get older again, then you'll begin reading them.
Yes.
And it's kind of recovering that sense of questioning and somehow trying to find a way that those deeper questions are kind of part of our nature. And we often need to hear stories to tell us about about what's the truth about the world that we can't get on our own.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. If we think about someone might bring up something like the allegory of the cave, right? Of course, it's an allegory, it's a story, but it is being so focused on what's projected in front of us, right? And if you escape the cave, when you come back down, you need an art of what he calls a periagoge, or turning around. How do you get somebody distracted from the shadows on the wall to even look in the other direction, right? And I would say that is, the sort of the rhetorical art, the art of storytelling, the art of, moving somebody quickly to, look one way instead of another.
Yeah, and maybe that's another way of putting it, is that we're always already in a world of images.
Yes.
Right? So really the question is, do we have good images or bad images, or you might even maybe say effective images or ineffective images, right? Ones that are actually healthy and helping us, or we also have a lot of, false images.
Yes. Yeah, which, again, the terms, the sort of, Greek root words here that we might be looking at are, icons or idols, right? And so, to what degree is what they're representing true versus, if they're all not the things themselves, then are they representing true things or false things?
Yes. I think it is kind of an interesting way of, even we can look at all of creation. Yeah. Right? Creation itself is, in a way, some kind of image of the creator, and therefore it can be an icon of the wonder. We can kind of see the beauty of nature, and we can wonder at the wonder of the creator that somehow made everything, right? Or we can kind of turn creation into, an idol and expect it to satisfy us.
Yes. I mean, that's sort of one of Tolkien's justifications for writing creative fantasy and being involved in it, is because not only are we created beings, but we're created in the image of a creator. So we're called to be as creative as possible. And so he, along with MacDonald, realized that we can't create ex nihilo, but he termed it subcreation, right? The ability to weave together, things that were extant in ways that are creative.
Can you say more about subcreation? I mean, that seems like a really important idea.
Yeah, that's one of the key, in his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien gives a brief clip of a poem called Mythopoeia, myth making, and he claims that this is our birthright, right? We are created beings that are called to participate in creation, and not just in the things of creation, but in the act of creation itself, right? And so the probably creative act, in its highest form for Tolkien, would be the story, right? Would be the world building, would be starting kind of from intellectual scratch and building up from the raw materials that are around us, right?
Okay, that reminds me a little bit of, is it Chesterton in his Everlasting Man, right? He tells the story of when you first see kind of human beings, evidence of human beings, they're in caves and they do these weird things, which are totally unlike our image of the caveman. Yeah. Right? They sit around and paint. Yeah. No, right? And I did in some of the classes I do, I'll actually show, if you just go online, you can find images really all over the globe from somewhere between like 15,000 to 30,000 years ago of paintings on walls of these caves. And it's, human beings paint. Yeah. And I think Chesterton says, this art is the signature of man. Could you explain that more?
Well, I don't know if I can explain it, but I would say, it is this idea that we are, from our earliest history that we can detect, we are interested in storytelling, in depicting images, in some way recording what's going around us, but not necessarily in these faithful material ways, right? No one's going. We can look at the images and of cave drawings and recognize them, but not necessarily. They're not one-to-one. Correspondences between the image and the things around us, right? Yeah.
So if we then. The idea you're suggesting here of sub-creation. So Tolkien suggests that when we tell stories, we're kind of imitating the creator, and we're creating like a secondary creation, right? A creation within the first creation. What do you think, in a way, can go wrong with that?
I mean, and Tolkien, talks about it as well, and a lot of things can go wrong. One of the simple things is it's not easy to do, right? Some people think it's the easiest kind of writing because you can just make up anything, but it's not going to be satisfactory if it doesn't have what he calls some sort of inner coherence, right?
Yeah.
It has to have a logic that sustains it. And George MacDonald was talking about this as well in his, the cultivation of the imagination. You have to have a logic that works within the fairyland or the fairy story or the fantasy world that you're building, or else it's not going to ring true. Right.
Okay.
And so there's that simple sort of thing. But you can tell bad stories, right? One sense they're ineffective. The other sense they dream up worlds that we wouldn't want to live in, or that we shouldn't want to live in. And for all their power, that can be negative. But George MacDonald makes, I think, a really good point, which is the key here isn't to suppress the imagination, because when you do, you can't surgically remove it. You just bubble it up into untrained, perhaps dark imaginations that then imagine these worlds, not because they want to, but because they've never been fostered.
And there was I think you're probably familiar with that survey. I think it was in England, of the best 100 books of the 20th century, and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I think was the number one, right?
You can't.
It kind of shocked everyone. But so, what is it about his work? Right, this great Lord of the Rings trilogy, this great myth that's been turned into movies, and I guess even right now is continuing to be popular, right, on Amazon, some version of it that we can maybe talk about another day, not today. But what is it about his work that is so attractive to people?
Yeah, I think it is hitting on this sort of the aridness of the imagination as a faculty it's cultivated, right, in school and learning. We desire. He had talked about this sort of desire on fairy stories to have converse with other people or to see other times, right? And so something like the Lord of the Rings speaks to both those desires. To go to distant lands, to talk to people who are other than human, and to see times other than the ones that we are in. And that's something that, I think we had much more access to pre-modernity, whether or not it was intentional or if it was just the types of stories that we were telling and the sorts of things that we could imagine, right? And, really, I think that you see Tolkien as sort of more this culmination of this tradition.
Interesting.
Than the beginning. I think, unfortunately, as the culmination, we get a lot of imitators of Tolkien afterwards. And so creative fantasy does not become that creative.
Okay.
If you read the sort of, pre-fantasy writers before Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, you get things that are totally alien, totally different. And, and things that are imitations of, just fairy stories as well. So you get the sort of soft, fun, trite sort of stuff, but you also get, imaginative worlds that don't talk about dwarfs, don't have elves in them, are something other than. And I think Tolkien appreciated that sort of creativity more than, here are the elves, here are the dwarves, here's my other, here's my creative world, which just happens to be a sub Tolkien world.
Interesting. And so these kind of great stories that he tells, it's almost like we go on an adventure.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many people today that kind of lack that adventure. And maybe they find it in video games. Maybe they find it occasionally in watching Netflix. But it seems more and more that people don't find it. People struggle to find it in their work.
Yes,
they often struggle to find it in relationships. I think many young people sometimes struggle to find it in school.
Yes,
right. So, how would you? What is it about? Like, how is reading a story? And if I'm going to put it somewhat provocatively, right? Like, how is reading a story going to help me find kind of an adventure in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting insofar as you look back and you look at the tradition. Sometimes we can just say this is a tradition of storytelling, right?
Okay.
And this is imitative or built off that this work and that work. But if we can start seeing what some of the authors are trying to do, there are at least I think good arguments for the fact that someone like Plato in the Republic is or in the Apology and some other places holding up Socrates as a new hero, and that the Republic is a sort of Odyssey, right? And then we go to St. Augustine's Confession, and at one time, he seems to be criticizing the old epics, but at the same time he's writing a new epic, right? A spiritual odyssey. And so if we, I would posit, to be provocative again, if we, could cultivate the art of story a little bit more, we wouldn't just lament the loss of some of these great stories. We'd be able to adapt and, appropriate what's good about the tradition of storytelling and give it to, our own time. And that sort of longing for good stories would be, addressed a little more positively.
Yeah, I heard that, I think it was George Lucas, when he was writing the original Star Wars trilogy, he actually studied a lot of myth. You remember the name? Who was the person he was studying?
So Joseph Campbell, I think.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell. But he's actually, so he was deliberately trying to recover a sense of these classical myths, these classical stories, and try to write a story. Yeah. And it's interesting that in some ways, that story, which had the worst special effects, right, of any of them.
It is, it's really difficult.
Is also the one that was the most kind of compelling. Yeah. And the one to which later stories are said, oh, this isn't as good, even though the CGI is better. Yeah. But somehow the story put us on this adventure, this quest.
I'm laughing because I'm a big Star Wars fan from childhood, and going back, especially after the sort of disastrous prequel trilogy, going back and watching the original, I'm like, maybe it wasn't that good, but I still love it, right? But I mean, that was like looking at his inspirations were something that actually made me think, maybe I could even tell stories, because you look at the Joseph Campbell, you look at the myths, but then you see also he's inspired by the C.S. Lewis space trilogy, Perelandria, Out of the Silent Planet, and you see, and that hideous strength, and you're like, oh, okay. And also like The Searchers, Westerns, the Hidden Fortress, Samurai movie, and you start looking at these sources, and then you read someone like On Fairy Stories, J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, and he talks about, you can't create a new leaf, but you can look back at the tree of story or dip into the soup of story and bring something else new. So knowing these stories is what helps to, or at least in part, what helps to cultivate new stories, right? Appreciating them for substance, not just as diversion.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And in some ways, if what you said about subcreation is true, then the best of stories are not they're not just like made up, so to speak. They're imitations of the reality.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's almost like in the story, we see something about reality that we couldn't see until it's there. So the story ends up becoming kind of somewhat true, because we live in the same creation, right, that Homer did.
Yeah. Yes.
So some of the stories, when we hear like, I don't know, when you hear about the wrath of Achilles in the Iliad, and you kind of see how he can't get his anger under control, and it ends up hurting him. So many people in the story, his best friend is killed because his anger and resentment. And then, we look at our own lives and we begin to say, oh, wait a second, how have my resentments and my angers hurt myself, right, and hurt other people?
Yeah, and even more sort of essentially, right, his problem, he admits, is knowing what he should do and not doing it, right?
Yeah.
And so how many times, so even if we haven't had wrath or revenge on our mind, how many times have we known the right thing to do and then not acted on that? Like seen it in the face and say, but I'm just not motivated to do the thing.
Yeah, one quick thing before we take a break. I noticed I've just been listening to Lord of the Rings again, and it's interesting how many times the characters struggle to make a decision. And it was kind of, I think there's a way in which sometimes maybe in modernity, we think there is a right decision. And if we get enough information, we can make it.
Yes.
And I think this, of course, is just largely not true. Yeah. In the world, there is always more information. Yeah. There's more information than we could ever take in at once. Yeah. And so to a certain extent, every decision carries a risk.
Yes.
Right? We can't control the outcomes. Not every outcome is foreseeable. We have to somewhat hazard guess.
Yeah, and that leads to
yeah.
the other part, right? The sort of rhetorical part. We've lost the arts of probable reasoning, right? We think that it's all deductive, right? But and certain and necessary. But really, most of our practical decisions are what's likely to happen, right? Out of all the possible outcomes, what's the best way to try to bring about one that's good?
Yeah, and in some ways that gives us a certain amount of freedom, recognizing that we will make mistakes. Like one of the beauty in the Lord of the Rings story is many of the characters, they don't know quite what to do, and sometimes they make wrong decisions, and yet they're still heroes.
Yes.
They're still heroes, not because they always make the right decisions, but because they don't give up.
Yeah, they hazard, you said, they hazard the right decision, and sometimes it's not, and they have to deal with it.
And when we're working with young people, I think so often, sometimes people feel the stress that they have to make the right decision about which courses, like what major to do, what career to go in, because the future of their life and perhaps the future of the world, the future of the church, the future of everything is kind of dependent upon them getting it right. And kind of one of the beauties is we never get it right.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's the willingness to stick to it.
Yeah.
It's the willingness not to give up, to continue to try to seek the good. In the midst of our lives, right, to continue in the midst of suffering and mistakes, to still say fundamentally, right, it is good that we are here, right? God, this is a good creation you've given us despite the mess we've made of it.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And it's just it's humorous when a student has these different options. They're like, which should I do? And I ask them which they want to do. And they're like, I'm not sure. I'm like, well, would you be equally happy with either? And they're like, yeah, sure. Then I'm like, well, flip a coin. I mean, just make it. If one compels you, take that one. But if not, then just like close your eyes, point, and there you go. You made a decision. So.
Well, that's great. Let's take a quick break.
All right, thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. If you'd like to support our mission, we invite you to prayerfully consider joining our Annunciation Circle, a monthly giving program aimed at supporting our staff, faculty, and Catholic faith formation. You can visit us at avemaria.edu to learn more. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Dr. Jasso, please tell me a little bit about how you got interested in studying fantasy literature and rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, it was always a personal sort of interest of mine, something I sort of did, in my spare time.
Okay.
And the rhetoric was, something that I came to after I started out as a theater major, and I was like, I don't want to study that.
Wow.
And I was also in debate and forensics. I was like, I could do this and do anything. And the first work I read was the Gorgias, and I was like, all right, but I get the joke because this is also very effectively written. So I double majored in philosophy at the time, and stayed with the rhetoric. As I saw connections and learned more about the Inklings, and saw their work on language, Owen Barfield, and some of the critical stuff that Tolkien and Lewis were doing, I realized that there was a connection there. And as I worked backwards from their influences to George MacDonald and Andrew Lang and some of the other sort of pre-Tolkien writers, William Morris, and read some of their critical works, I was like, oh, there's a whole project here. And then when I was at Penn State, I was in an English department doing interdisciplinary rhetoric, and I said I could put together a syllabus on fantasy, modern fantasy, its birth and its sort of rhetorical impact, how it was trying to make these arguments and do these things in society. And they let me do that. It was a popular class. I was able to teach it twice, and before I left, I was scheduled to teach it as a grad course. And then and then I came here and found a similar audience to who's interested in these works, and from teaching I've turned into scholarship, and so it's probably the next phase of things that I'm going to be doing academic work on.
It seems that many people today have a mistrust of rhetoric. That's just rhetoric, or don't let the rhetoric take you away from the facts or something. What would you? I mean, is rhetoric bad?
Yeah, I mean, so the fantasy analogy I use in my rhetoric class is use the Harry Potter analogy of it's both the dark arts and defense against the dark arts, right? Really, it's unique in such, or Star Wars, there's the dark side and light side of the Force. It's unique in such that its power is not going to be checked except for by a good rhetoric. I think Gorgias in his Enchantment of Helen makes a similar argument, which is he blames rhetoric for or persuasion for stealing Helen away, but he's also a sophist. And I ask my students, why would he do that? that? And they're like, oh, because if there's that out there, you have to be able to meet it, right? As a sort of self-defense, yes, but also there's lots of eloquent sort of myths from Plato and Cicero and Isocrates about just the fact that we do it. We can't live without persuasion. We can't live without talking with people and trying to get them to commune with each other, to build societies and build laws. So it is the dark arts, defense against the dark arts, but used properly, it's also this constructive tool that's at the foundation of society.
So that maybe what I hear you saying is that it's kind of like insofar as we use words, we're necessarily being rhetorical. And we're always trying to communicate something like what we want and how we see the world. And other people, of course, are communicating to us with words. And which means they're using rhetoric as well. So if we don't study rhetoric or try to somehow use rhetoric effectively, we're just using rhetoric poorly. Or being trapped by others.
It's like the imagination. If you try to suppress it, it's just going to be used anyway and used poorly. And if somebody else can master it, then used potentially against you unless they're a good person. I think Cicero kind of coined it the best. I'm going to paraphrase here. He was, in the beginning of his On Invention or De Inventione, he says, I've often thought about if it's a good or a bad. And he boiled it down to the pair of wisdom and eloquence, right? Wisdom without eloquence is what he called, weak, ineffective, right? Can benefit an individual, but hardly ever of his benefit of society. But eloquence without wisdom can be potentially harmful, destructive, right? So what you want is that union of the ability to sort of think and calculate and strategize, but then also be able to communicate with others and join with others in productive endeavors.
And in our society today, it seems like we have tons of communications media. We have tons of TV, tons of marketing. We kind of are never away from marketing. There's lots of jobs in marketing. Can marketing be good?
I believe so. I mean, that's not my area of expertise, but in teaching media society in the church, a lot of what the church has to say about media, kind of continues this conversation about rhetoric. And, insofar as we want healthy economies and we want people to have access to good products, then marketing is a good, right? Insofar as it tells the truth about, and it can be entertaining, and it can be, can also serve the person, the businesses. But insofar as it brings to the fore products and experiences and other sort of consumer goods that people are wanting, that are good for them, or at least not bad, then it can be a good. It's good to have a healthy economy. Right? It's not good when your society is impoverished, right? So.
On a slightly different note. C.S. Lewis, he has an essay or a sermon that was originally given, The Weight of Glory, but he reminds me at one time where he says, do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? And he says, remember your fairy tales. He says that spells are not only used for casting enchantments, but also breaking them. And I think there he says that you and I have been under the enchantment of worldliness for the last couple centuries, right, in which all of our philosophy and education is aimed with the idea that the good of life is to be found in this world, on this earth. So how is it maybe that particularly not only rhetoric in general, but some kind of fantasy rhetoric helps us to recognize that maybe, the happy life is not just, is not just an earthly life?
Yeah. I mean, so, it's interesting you bring it up because that resonates with something that Gorgias said in Communion of Helen. He called logos, right, a pharmacon, that could both kill, right, a drug that can kill but also can heal. And he called it magic. And Aristophanes actually accused Socrates of what he called psychagogia, right, soul leading, which for there means conjuring, the sort of enchantment.
Okay.
But Plato uses that word as his definition of rhetoric, Socrates' definition in the Phaedrus, which is leading souls by words, by logos, right? And so if we kind of fast forward to C.S. Lewis, he talks about what he says, other worlds, right? He found out what they're for by reading Voyage to Arcturus, right? And he says that they're for spiritual adventures. They're for taking us into the realm of the spirit, setting up circumstances that we can't, spiritual experiments, you might say, thought experiments that we can't play out here, but we can see played out in these fantasy literatures. I think he's likely echoing George MacDonald, who in Fantace talks about his main characters in fairyland, and he slips into this sort of like meditation and says, "Excuse me, reader, for having slipped into the deeper fairyland of the soul." Right, and so we can play out, give voice and personages to personify ideas and concepts that we can only theorize. That's why I think fantasy, science fiction, they're called speculative fiction, because we can theorize about things that we can't see play out in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Do you have? It seems like some of that aspect of like seeing that dimension of the soul, the hungers and maybe thirsts of the soul for something beyond this world, for maybe the source of this world, for God. That it also seems that there's some aspect of, if we think about great Shakespeare plays, I mean, how often great Shakespeare plays have a wedding at the end, that maybe even something like the good of marriage is somehow almost, is almost like a good of the soul that you can't just see from the outside.
Yes.
And it's partly why so many of these great tales and a lot of the, the romance stories in the Middle Ages and later were often some kind of combination of both a quest, a quest, a battle, but also some kind of beauty.
Yeah. No, the four qualities that Tolkien talks about in fantasy. He talks about it in fairy stories. Fantasy is one of them. Recovery is another one, and that's where he talks about Chestertonian fantasy on kind of a smaller scale. And escape is one that he's like, hey, I think we're mixing up when we condemn fantasy for escapism, the flight of the deserter with the escape of the prisoner, right?
Yeah.
And the last one is consolation. He talks about the eucatastrophe, this amazing turn at the end of fairy stories that often happens that makes us feel this sort of divine providence, right? The goodness of the world around us. And I think that last one might be what you're kind of talking about there, with the wedding, or we have the battles, we have the quest, but it ends on almost an amazing note, a miraculous note of goodness or consolation.
Yeah, and that in part we don't discover this about ourselves unless, in a way, someone tells us these stories, and we begin to say, "Oh, wait a second, I could be like that."
Yeah.
Right. I could be like that. That great hero. Yeah. Perhaps somehow. And I think when we hear that, at least, I think it's always a fun question to ask people after they see a movie with which character did you identify the most? I think we naturally kind of want to imitate some character, and we really want to imitate maybe like the ideals that we see in that character.
Yeah, I think you asked before, like, how can it go wrong? And it is, there is this sort of escapism where you're just like, I just want to see stuff that's not around me, which can be fine for a diversion, but when you don't come back and you just get lost, that could be a problem. But looking at the tradition, that's why it's fun to see someone like Socrates in the Apology equate himself with like Achilles, right? And then you start seeing this, these like, I could be like Socrates. Achilles may be hard, but now when I start thinking about the courage that takes Socrates to, face death, and compare that to Achilles in battle, I'm like, oh yeah, these are things that. So the breadth of this sort of literature, I think, is really important to be exposed to, because there's things that are definitely closer to home, but the epic literature is great, and the sort of intermediary sort of stories can help us make connections with the I want to be Aragorn, but I'm not.
I think it's interesting too the way you mention that sense of where it can kind of help us to almost this aspirational, and C.S. Lewis writes an essay on 3 ways of writing for children. Yeah. In there, I only remember 2 at the moment, but the main 2 are, one, he says there's a way of telling stories for children where you basically, and I think in some ways he's thinking of like what we would call young adult readers here. But one way is basically where you kind of gratify their desire for adulation, their desire to be praised and worshipped. So you tell the stories about the person who gets rejected off the basketball team and then comes back and becomes the captain, right? Or the person who does, the person who becomes, it isn't popular at school, but then eventually by the end is, the most popular, the most popular girl or the most popular guy in high school. And he says basically this is the same thing that in adult literature is, where you solve the crime, you get the money, you get the girl, you're on the beach. And he says all of these are kind of somewhat gratifying our imagination, and they're gratifying our appetites, and they're gratifying our ego. But he contrasts this with what he thinks is a true fairy story, because the fairy story, he says, has a moral dimension, which it calls for a kind of not just an external conversion, but an internal conversion. And he even goes so far as to say that reading them is like an ascesis. It's like an ascetical work, that when you read these stories, it almost challenges you to question your desires. Are your desires merely to gratify your ego, or are they to maybe deflate your ego and to discover something greater?
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think ties it back to that tradition in rhetoric, to instruct, to delight, and to move. Oftentimes, the mythic tradition and the folktale tradition can be boiled down to instruction, right? And sometimes, like at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, Frank L. Baum is like, we don't need moral instruction anymore. This is just meant to delight, right? But the higher kind of movement, what George MacDonald and I believe Chesterton, Lewis, Tolkien are after is, sure, it'd be great to instruct, it'd be great to delight, but it's really that movement, right? The inward reflection, but then also the sort of movement towards ascension, right? Elevation.
And maybe in a way, I don't know. What do you think? Why is it that we're maybe so frightened, so like we just don't want to be instructed, or then, but somehow like not wanting to be instructed, we haven't become wise.
Yeah.
Like why? Do you have any sense for why maybe moderns especially dislike instruction?
One big, we can go back to the Republic, right? Which is when you get to the democracy, people, kind of chastise teachers, and students are running the show, and cowardice becomes prudence, and wisdom becomes, something that's belabored or, waste of time.
And I guess it's like that. It's like Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. There's no problem today that Socrates and Aristotle and Plato didn't somewhat encounter.
But one thing that I thought was interesting was that when you mentioned, that sort of writing where it's like the wish fulfillment, right? I think there's been a turn in some of the sort of YA sort of stories, which is not the unpopular person becomes the popular person, but just stay unpopular. Like there's one of my dissertation director had, and I'm not going to do the accent. He was Greek and he had a thick Greek accent, but he started saying disparaging things about Mr. Rogers. We live in Pittsburgh, and Mr. Rogers was close, and I was like, how do you not like Mr. Rogers? And his point was, look, I don't like you the way you are. I like you better than you are. And I was like, okay. And so I think there is almost a movement of, no, you're fine just the way you are. There's no need to put effort into betterment, into perfection. Oh my gosh, why would you strive for that? That's just, unattainable and not healthy, right? It's just going to cause you stress and anxiety. And so I think that the desire not to be instructed is that desire to, if I could kind of diagnose the problem of the age, it's desire not to feel anxious, not to feel stress, to avoid anything that might cause a friction internally. And so,
but in many ways, it's. Do you think is it working?
Oh no, no! I think that's the ailment of the age, right? It might be it might be the same or a bit of an extension of what Walker Percy might have called the modern malaise, right? Just it's fine. Everything's fine.
But somehow, when we say that, the one thing that we believe is that it's not fine.
Yes.
That there's something strange. That somehow, like when we feel anxious, somehow the more we can feel that and yet act anyway. Yeah. Somehow, like the anxiety. It's not that it goes away or the fear goes away, but that we learn how not to react. Yeah. But to respond.
Yes.
And this seems like Aristotle, and I was actually even, C.S. Lewis, I think in letter 29 of the Screwtape Letters, talks all about courage and cowardice. And sometimes he even says something powerful there where he says maybe, I can't remember if he says thousands but thousands of men, as he puts it, discovered their cowardice for the first time in the First World War. Their own personal cowardice. and in doing so discovered the moral world for the first time.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's this recognition that I almost feel like he wants to whisper and say, like, you too?
No.
like you too are a coward? Mm-hmm. And for me to be able to say, yes, I too am a coward. I struggle with fear. Mm-hmm. Fear sometimes has gotten the best of me. I struggle with anger. Anger sometimes has gotten the best of me. And in different ways, I think these stories tell us a little bit about that. Often our fears and angers, right? Our fight or flight.
Yeah.
Are I'm not doing that well with them. Yeah. And then when we begin to articulate I'm not doing well, rather than just saying it's okay, yes, it's good that I exist. I'm not a horror, you know what I mean? It's not like the world wouldn't be better off without me. Yeah. But on the other hand, when I can say that I'm struggling, it's almost like in one of the Gospels where Jesus says something like basically a blind guides leading the blind. Yeah. And part of the things we're supposed to recognize is that I'm blind. And I don't know how to put it. Somehow it's this very recognition of our failures that allows us to move forward.
Yeah, so
it's not, I don't know how to put it. Like I just, anyway, for me, I find both, in my own life and in my teaching, somehow creating that space.
Yeah. No, I try to tell my students when we read Platonic dialogues, I was like, everyone wants to be Socrates, but I'm like, you're not. You're the other guy, right? That's the problem. And you got to listen to other people. Yeah. I think there's a great example we were talking about just recently in the 4th volume of season of Stranger Things. They had a character that was new, who was like really big into like Dungeons and Dragons, was like doing all these battles, but it turned out that he was a coward, right? And when faced with that, he's like, look, I'm not the guy, right? I'm not going to do the brave stuff. But eventually, part of the arc is that he does face that. And so, part of the fantasy is helping us see and experience things that maybe we wouldn't other experience. But there's always that danger of, having it just be false, right? And then realizing, hopefully, the nice thing about, let's say, this fantasy was that it showed the person being sort of diverted into a fantasy world, faced with needing to be courageous and not, but finding that as a weakness in himself, and then being
really
now I'm going to be courageous. I'm like, okay, so that's what stories can do.
Yeah, really. and it may be that partly what we begin to recognize is the real quest that each of us is on is the quest of our own lives, right? Really, like, who am I going to choose to become?
Yeah,
right. And it's not just who was I and how do I live in accord with that, but how do I become the person I could become if I began to try to live my life a bit more intentionally, and begin to see maybe myself as a story. When we have in John 1, right? John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. We often think of the Word as just kind of maybe philosophical truth, but the Word is also story.
Yeah.
So in the beginning was the story.
Yeah,
and maybe in a way we tell ourselves false stories about ourselves. Yeah, no. and to learn that true story.
Yeah, I think that's great because what you have there is kind of circles back to everything we've been talking about, because you have the word logos, right? That in the Greek is anything from word to argument to account to the reason of the cosmos, right? In the Latin, it gets bifurcated into ratio et oratio, to wisdom and eloquence, right? And so being able to see the reason as a story, right? I think of St. Irenaeus, who said that God had 3 great speeches: creation, the Bible, and the incarnation, right? Yeah. And so obviously those are rational. Those are also stories, but they're also what Irenaeus called the great speeches of God, and we can approach creation like a book or like a story, and so seeing all those things sort of looped together, and then seeing ourselves as a story in progress. It's trite, but I think it's also true that we can write our stories, or at least participate in our own narratives, which goes to show that some of the trite things of today, some of the things like it's not a bad thing to not want to be anxious. And I think progressives want to move away from the bad, and the conservatives want to go back to a good. But we can agree that something's not working. Yeah. And and anxiety is not a good in and of itself, but it can lead to good. So being always able to see, there's some agreement even in our disagreement, I think, is the beginning to both good argument and good storytelling.
Yeah, I think I saw recently something from Jordan Peterson where he said, don't compare yourself to others, compare yourself to the person you were yesterday and try to become a better version of that tomorrow. And I think when we do that, we begin to discover that we're kind of little stories. And I think in doing so, we can find kind of a little sense of peace and direction. As we close, I wanted to ask you 3 questions. So what's a book you've been reading lately?
I've been actually reading some of the works of Charles Williams. And so I've gotten through one of the Inklings, The Oddest Inkling, gotten through his Descent into Hell and The War in Heaven. But the one that I'm in the middle of right now, which is a great, I'm having so much fun with it, is Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, which is a book I've heard that everybody owns but nobody reads. Or at least that was true in the 80s, So, yeah.
Well, that's great. And second question, what's a daily practice that you do to, kind of find meaning and purpose in your own story?
Yeah, I'd say just recently again, I try to both exercise, like ride, go ride on a bike, but at the same time, I get into audiobooks a lot. So I start with a chaplet of St. Michael, and my daughter actually made me one for my wrist on audio, and try to meditate on that. And then I listen to audiobooks while I go on a bike ride for a few miles. So
that's great. And last question is maybe what's one big kind of falsehood that you believed about God that kind of like hurt you, and when you discovered the truth, how did it help?
Oh, that's a tough one. Let's see. A falsehood that I believed about God that hurt me. I guess, it is one of those things that if I think about it, right, there is the sense, I wouldn't say it's a falsehood, but I understood it falsely, which was that everything's going to be all right.
Yeah.
And when you come up in times and things aren't all right, it makes you wonder, what your relationship is, right? And so rethinking what it means that everything's going to be all right in the sort of, scheme of things, that's helped me to sort of deal with the things that weren't all right, and to understand my relationship with God. So.
Wow. Well, Dr. John Jasso, thanks so much for being with us today, and really appreciated your just really kind of opening up the tradition of imagination and rhetoric and Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton with us. So thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. If you like this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcast app to help others find the show. And if you want to take the next step, please consider joining our Annunciation Circle so we can continue to bring you more free content. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Theology Show.